The desert wind carried the smell of gunpowder and blood. Margaret stood alone, Winchester in hand, 5 outlaws circling her like wolves. The leader's voice cut through the silence. Your ghost hand. A name she had buried for 20 years. A name that meant 87 dead men. But these outlaws didn't come to kill Tune. Their leader came to thank her for saving his life in the Civil War. What happens when your darkest secret rides back into your life, not for revenge, but for answers? Before we dive into this story, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from right now. And if you love Western tales of redemption, hit that subscribe button and like this video. Now let's begin. 36 hours earlier, that same desert had been peaceful. The sun hung low over the Arizona desert, bleeding gold and crimson across a sky too wide to hold secrets. The air shimmered with heat even as evening crept in, carrying the scent of sage and dust, and something older. Something the land remembered but never spoke of. In that vast emptiness stood a cabin square, shouldered and stubborn, built by hands that knew the cost of every nail driven true. Margaret Carson stood in the yard. Blood ran dark from her left shoulder, soaking through the faded blue fabric of her shirt. The Winchester in her hands still held the warmth of recent fire. Around her, 5 riders sat their horses in a loose circle, their weapons drawn but wavering. Dust hung in the air between them, like the smoke of battles long finished but never truly ended. The man at the center, tall and weathered, stared at her with eyes that had seen too much and understood too late. His voice came out rough, disbelieving. Your ghost hand. The words hung there, a name that should have stayed buried with the war dead. Margaret met his gaze, steady despite the pain flowering in her shoulder, despite the trembling in her legs that she would not let these men see. Behind her, the cabin door stood open. Inside, a 12-year-old girl waited, trusting that the woman she called mother would come back. That trust was worth more than breath, worth more than pride, worth fighting for. The standoff held. No one moved. The desert watched. Then darkness swallowed the scene whole. 36 hours earlier, that same desert had been peaceful. The morning air carried a different quality, then cool and clean, untouched by gun smoke or the copper smell of blood. Margaret stood behind her daughter, adjusting the girl's stance with gentle pressure on her shoulders. Breathe out slow, Sarah. Let your body settle before you squeeze. Sarah, 12 years old, with her mother's determined jaw and her own fierce brown eyes, sighted down the barrel of the small rifle. The tin can sat on a fence post 30 yards away, dented from yesterday's practice but still standing. The girl's finger tightened on the trigger. The shot cracked across the empty land. The can jumped and spun but stayed put. I missed again, frustration colored Sarah's voice. You hit where you aimed, Margaret said. That's what matters. The can's not trying to kill you. Sarah lowered the rifle and turned to look up at her mother. Why do I need to know this, Ma? We're just farmers. Margaret took the rifle, checked it with practiced efficiency, and set it against the fence. Her hands moved with a sureness that spoke of long familiarity with weapons, though she had not picked up a gun in anger for 3 years. Not since Thomas died. Not since she had promised him she would leave that other life buried. The frontier doesn't ask if you're ready, Margaret said. She knelt down to meet Sarah's eyes. It comes when it comes, and when it does, I want you able to stand. It's like you can better than I can. Sarah studied her mother's face, reading the lines there, the history written in scar tissue and sun-weathered skin. You're thinking about something, Sam? Just old memories, honey, nothing for you to worry on. But the lie tasted bitter. Margaret straightened and looked out across the land she and Thomas had claimed from the raw desert. 3 years of sweat and starvation had turned this patch of nothing into something. A garden where vegetables grew despite the heat. A small corral where 2 horses grazed. The cabin itself solid and square, built to last. Built to be a home. Thomas had given her that. A reason to stop running. A place where Ghost Hand could die and Margaret Carson could live. She wondered if he had known somehow that it could not last forever. That the past was not something you buried, but something you carried, and sometimes the weight became too much. Inside the cabin, Sarah set the table for breakfast. Margaret stood at the stove, stirring cornmeal mush in the heavy iron pot. Through the window, she could see the fence line, the garden, the empty road that led to the distant town. Everything looked as it should. Everything felt wrong. Ma, you're stirring it to death. Margaret blinked and realized she had been stirring the same spot for the past minute, her mind elsewhere. She forced a smile and dished out 2 bowls. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind that came from 2 people who knew each other's rhythms. Sarah had been with her for 2 years now. 2 years since Margaret had found the girl kneeling beside her dead parents, silent with shock, too young to understand that cholera did not care about fair or unfair. Margaret had not planned to take in a child, had not planned to become anyone's mother. But she had looked at that girl alone and hollow-eyed and seen herself at 20, seen what happened when no one reached out a hand. So she had reached out hers. "Tell me about the garden today," Margaret said. "What needs tending?" Sarah launched into a detailed report of which plants needed water, which had been visited by rabbits in the night, which were thriving despite the heat. Margaret listened, letting the normalcy of it settle over her like a blanket. This was her life now. Gardens and lessons and the simple satisfaction of watching a child grow strong. But even as Sarah talked, Margaret's attention kept drifting to the window, to the road, to the empty horizon where dust rose in lazy spirals whenever the wind picked up, waiting for something she could not name but felt in her bones. The past, she thought, the past coming home. The rider appeared just after noon when the sun stood straight overhead and the heat pressed down like a physical thing. Margaret saw him first, a dark shape against the bright land, moving at the steady pace of someone who had traveled far but was not running from anything. She recognized the horse before she saw the rider clearly, a big gray gelding that belonged to Sheriff Robert Hayes. Sarah had gone inside to escape the heat. Margaret stood on the porch, one hand resting on the post Thomas had carved with his initials and hers intertwined. She waited as Hayes rode up, noting the set of his shoulders, the way he did not smile when he saw her. "Margaret," he touched the brim of his hat. "Robert, it's the middle of the week. You're not here for cornbread." Hayes swung down from the saddle, his movements careful in the way of men whose backs protested more with every passing year. He was 55, had been Thomas's friend before he was hers, and had never once asked about the scars on her hands or the way she sometimes woke screaming in the night. "I brought news," he said. "Bad news." Margaret gestured to the chairs on the porch. Hayes sat heavily. She waited. He pulled off his hat, ran a hand through gray-streaked hair, and finally met her eyes. "There's a gang operating in the territory. 6 men. They hit 2 ranches south of here last week. Took supplies, horses, money. Roughed up the families, but didn't kill anyone. Plenty of gangs out here, Robert. Why ride all this way to tell me about one more?" "Because the leader's name is James Thornton." The name meant nothing to her, but Hayes was watching her face too carefully. She kept her expression neutral, waiting. "Thornton's ex-Confederate," Hayes continued. "Fought at Shiloh, Antietam, Gettysburg. After the war, he went outlaw. Been robbing his way across 3 territories for the past 15 years. Shiloh, the word hit like a fist to the stomach. Margaret's hand tightened on the chair arm, but she did not move otherwise. Did not let Hayes see the sudden spike of memory, smoke and screaming, and the wet sound of bayonets finding flesh. "What does he want?" Her voice came out level. "That's the strange part." Hayes leaned forward. "Word is he's looking for someone, an old Union scout, someone from the war." The silence stretched. A crow called from somewhere in the distance. Margaret could hear her own heartbeat, too loud, too fast. "They got a name for this scout." Hayes nodded slowly. "Ghost Hand." There it was. The name she had not heard spoken aloud in 20 years. The name she had left behind when she rode away from the last battlefield, covered in other people's blood, unable to remember which side any of them had been on. Unable to care. "Ghost Hand's dead," Margaret said flatly. "Died in 65 after the war ended. I heard that story myself." "So did I. So did everyone." Hayes studied her. "But Thornton doesn't believe it. He's been searching, and now he's here in this territory asking questions." "What kind of questions?" "About women living alone. About anyone who came west after the war and never talked about where they came from. About people with military training who don't advertise it." Margaret stood and walked to the porch rail. Out in the corral, the horses grazed unconcerned. The garden grew. The world continued as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Just like that. Just that fast. "How many did you say? 6 men, all armed, all dangerous? You telling me to run, Robert?" I'm telling you to be careful. Lock your doors, keep your guns close, and if they come here, if they ask questions, give them nothing. Just supplies and send them on. Margaret turned to face him. You think they'll come here? I think, Hayes said carefully, that a widow living alone with a young girl who never talks about her past and moves like someone with training might be exactly what Thornton's looking for. After Hayes left, Margaret stood on the porch for a long time. The sun crept west, shadows lengthened. Inside, Sarah sang to herself as she worked on her lessons copying letters from the worn primer Margaret had bought in town. The sound should have been comforting. Instead, it felt fragile, like something that could shatter at the wrong word. Margaret went to the corral and saddled the bay mare. Sarah appeared in the doorway. Where are you going? To take you to Mrs. Patterson's for a few days. But why? I don't want to go to Mrs. Patterson's. She smells like turnips and makes me do needlework. Sarah, Margaret's voice carried the tone that meant no argument. There might be trouble coming. I need you safe. The girl's face shifted from protest to fear. What kind of trouble? The kind that's mine to handle, not yours. I want to help. Margaret crossed to her daughter and knelt, taking both small hands in her scarred ones. Listen to me. You help by staying safe, by trusting me to handle this. Can you do that? Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Promise you'll come get me. I promise. Say it like you mean it. Margaret pulled the girl close, breathing in the smell of her hair, sun and sage, and the faint sweetness of the soap they made together. I swear on everything I am Sarah Carson, I will come back for you. This is my fight. I don't lose. They rode together to Mrs. Patterson's homestead, 3 miles south. The old woman took one look at Margaret's face and asked no questions, just swept Sarah inside with promises of apple pie and a new litter of kittens to play with. Margaret stayed long enough to see Sarah settled to press a kiss to her forehead, to ignore the way her own heart cracked at the fear in those brown eyes. Then she rode home alone. The cabin felt too quiet. Margaret moved through it, checking locks, closing shutters. In the bedroom she shared with no one anymore, she knelt beside the bed and felt along the floorboards until her fingers found the loose one. It came up with a soft groan of protesting wood. Beneath lay the cedar chest. Margaret sat back on her heels, staring at it. 3 years since she had opened this. 3 years since she had allowed herself to even think about what lay inside. The chest was small, no bigger than a saddlebag, but it held more weight than anything else she owned. She lifted the lid. The smell hit her first. Gun oil and old canvas, and beneath it all, faint but unmistakable, the sharp mineral scent of black powder that no amount of time could completely erase. Inside, folded with military precision, lay the coat, dark blue wool worn at the elbows and collar. 2 rows of brass buttons, half of them missing, and on the shoulders, faded but still visible, the insignia of a Union Scout. First class, attached to the Army of the Tennessee under General Grant. Margaret lifted it out. The weight settled across her arms like an old burden she had thought she had put down, but had only been resting. Her fingers traced the bullet hole in the left sleeve, remembering the burning pain of lead passing through muscle, the way she had kept firing because stopping meant dying. The bloodstains on the hem that no amount of washing had ever fully removed. She closed her eyes. April, 1862, Shiloh, Tennessee. The peach orchard in bloom despite the violence, petals falling like snow through the smoke. She had been 20 years old and already too familiar with death. The second day of battle when the Confederate counterattack came and her unit found itself cut off, surrounded, facing annihilation. Margaret had been in a tree 60 feet up, watching troop movements. She had seen the gray coats closing in, had seen her men beginning to panic, had made the decision in a heartbeat. She started firing. One shot, one Confederate fell. Reload. Another shot, another man down. She did not think about their faces, their ages, whether they had families waiting. She thought only about keeping her men alive, about buying them time to retreat, about survival. When the smoke cleared, 16 Confederate soldiers lay dead or dying in that orchard, all from her rifle, all headshots or center mass, not one wasted bullet. Her men had escaped. She had climbed down from that tree, walked through the carnage she had created, and kept walking, kept firing, kept surviving. They started calling her Ghost Hand after that, because she struck from nowhere and left only corpses behind, because she moved through battlefields like smoke unseen until it was too late, because in 3 years of war, she had never missed a shot that mattered. She had killed 87 men before the war ended. She knew because she had counted each one carve their numbers into her memory like scars. 87 sons and brothers and fathers who never went home because Margaret had been faster, colder, more willing to do what needed doing. And then one day at Shiloh, she had found a Confederate soldier bleeding out in the mud. Young, maybe 19, crying for his mother as he clutched the ragged hole in his arm where a bayonet had gone through. She could have walked past, should have. He was the enemy, but she had stopped, had torn cloth from her own shirt and wrapped his wound tight enough to slow the bleeding, had given him water from her canteen, had looked into his terrified eyes and seen not a Confederate, but a boy who wanted to live. Why, he had gasped. Why save me? She had not answered, had simply finished the bandaging, checked that it would hold, and started to move on. But he had grabbed her wrist, desperate. What's your name? She should have stayed silent, but something in his eyes, some awful recognition of shared humanity in that place where humanity went to die, had made her answer. They call me Ghost Hand. Then she had vanished into the smoke and tried to forget, tried to bury the memory of compassion in a war that had no room for it. But the boy's face had stayed with her, haunted her through the rest of the war, through the slow, terrible years afterward, when she could not settle, could not sleep, could not forget. Until Thomas. Thomas had given her peace, had looked at her scarred hands and haunted eyes, and offered something simple and perhaps found a life where the past did not matter, where she could be just Margaret, where Ghost Hand could die and stay dead. She had thought that was enough, had thought 3 years was long enough to bury a name, a reputation, a history written in blood. But history did not stay buried, not when someone came looking. Margaret opened her eyes and looked at the coat in her lap. Then carefully she folded it and placed it back in the chest. Not yet, maybe not ever. She was not that woman anymore. She had promised Thomas. But beneath the coat lay the Winchester. The one she had carried through 2 years of war, maintained with obsessive care, fired so many times the stock had molded perfectly to her shoulder. She lifted it out, checked the action. The mechanism moved smooth as water, still perfectly aligned despite the years. Still ready. She loaded it. 20 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber. Then she carried it to the front room and leaned it against the wall beside the door. Just in case. Just because Robert Hayes had never lied to her and his warning sat heavy in her gut. The afternoon stretched toward evening. Margaret worked mechanically, checking the property, securing loose boards, making sure the horses had water and feed. Normal tasks, ordinary preparations, except she was preparing for war. As the sun dropped toward the horizon, she saw them. 6 riders moving in a loose line across the desert, still distant, maybe 2 miles out, but coming straight toward her land. No hurry, but no hesitation either. Men who knew where they were going. Margaret stood on the porch and watched them come. Her pulse stayed steady. Her hands did not shake. 20 years might have passed, but her body remembered this. The heightened awareness, the way time seemed to slow and sharpen every detail, crystallizing with perfect clarity. The way her mind began calculating distances, lines of fire cover and concealment. She had not wanted this, had done everything to avoid it. But if the past insisted on coming home, she would meet it standing. The riders approached as the last light bled from the sky, their shapes dark against the red and gold horizon. They stopped at the edge of her property just beyond the fence line. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the man at the center nudged his horse forward. Alone. He rode to within 20 feet of the porch and reined in. The dying light caught his face. Late 30s, maybe 40. Lean and weathered, with a scar down his right forearm that showed pale against tan skin. His eyes were gray, cold, assessing. He wore a long coat despite the heat, and beneath it Margaret could see the butt of a revolver riding low on his hip. Evening, ma'am. His voice carried easily in the still air. Polite, almost friendly. Name's James Thornton. My men and I have been riding hard. Wondered if we might trouble you for some water. Margaret stood at the top of the porch steps, hands loose at her sides. No weapon visible. She studied him, cataloging details. The way he sat his horse balanced, ready to move fast. The casual placement of his hand near his weapon. The way his eyes never stopped moving, taking in the cabin, the corral, the fence line, looking for threats, for opportunities. Water's by the well, she said. Help yourself and ride on. Appreciate the hospitality, ma'am, but we were hoping for more than just water. Maybe some food, a roof for the night. We can pay. No room, no food to spare. Take your water and go. Behind Thornton, the other five shifted in their saddles. Margaret tracked each movement without appearing to look directly at them. A big man with massive shoulders and a face like weathered stone. A smaller, wiry rider whose hand kept tapping against his thigh, nervous energy barely contained. Two men who looked enough alike to be brothers, both hard-eyed and watchful. And a younger one, barely more than a boy, sitting his horse with the uncertain posture of someone still learning this life. Thornton smiled. It did not reach his eyes. That's not very neighborly, ma'am. Out here, folks are supposed to help each other. Out here, Margaret said, folks are supposed to respect when they're not welcome. The big man swung down from his horse. His boots hit the ground with heavy thuds. He was huge, 6.5 feet tall, and built like a bull, all muscle and mean intention. Maybe the lady didn't hear you right, Jim, he said, his voice a low rumble. Maybe she needs help understanding. He started toward the porch. Margaret did not move, did not reach for a weapon, simply stood there watching him come, calculating, waiting. At 10 feet, he put his hand on his revolver. Now, old woman, we're going to come inside whether you like it or... Margaret moved. She came off the porch in a single fluid motion, closing the distance faster than his eyes could track. Her right hand caught his wrist before the gun cleared leather. She twisted sharp and precise, using his own momentum and size against him. Bone cracked like a gunshot in the quiet evening. The big man, Frank, screamed. High and shrill, nothing like the tough growl he had been using. Margaret held the broken wrist for 1 second longer, making sure he felt it, making sure the others saw. Then she released him and stepped back. Frank dropped to his knees, cradling the shattered wrist against his chest. His face had gone gray. He tried to speak, but only managed a strangled whimper. The wiry one, Billy, grabbed for his gun. Margaret's hand shot out faster than thought. She caught the cylinder of his revolver as it came up her thumb, finding the release by pure muscle memory. A twist, a pull, and the cylinder popped free. 6 brass cartridges tumbled out, falling to the dust with soft metallic pings. She tossed the useless revolver frame back to him. Billy stared at his now harmless weapon, then at Margaret, then at his weapon again. How did you... Margaret did not answer. She turned her attention to Thornton, who had not moved, though his hand now rested on his own gun. Their eyes met across the space between them. Something flickered in his face. Recognition. Uncertainty. He studied her more carefully now. The way she stood balanced and ready. The way she had moved, trained reflexes, military precision. The scars on her hands pale in the fading light. That wasn't luck, he said slowly. No, Margaret agreed. It wasn't. You've got training, military training. She did not confirm or deny, just waited. Thornton's eyes dropped to her left shoulder, lingered there. Margaret knew what he was looking for. The place where a bullet or blade might have left a scar, the kind of injury a soldier would carry. His gaze came back to her face. His expression had changed. The casual predator was gone, replaced by something harder. Something that saw her clearly now. We'll be back, he said. Not a threat, a statement of fact. I'll be here. Thornton studied her a moment longer. Then he turned his horse. Mount up. Frank, get on your horse or get left behind. Frank struggled to his feet, still cradling the ruined wrist. Billy helped him into the saddle. The 6 of them rode out slowly, not running, refusing to show the fear that Margaret could smell on them. She watched until they disappeared into the gathering dark. Then finally she allowed herself to shake. Inside the cabin, Margaret barred the door and closed the shutters. She lit a single lamp, keeping the wick low. The Winchester came off the wall. She checked it again, habit more than necessity, and set it across the table. Then she sat in the chair facing the door and waited. They would be back. Thornton was not a man who accepted defeat. Neither was the big one, Frank. And she had shown them too much. Shown them she was trained dangerous, not what she appeared to be. That would make them curious. Curious men were persistent men. And if Thornton was truly looking for Ghost Hand, she had just given him a very large clue. The night deepened. Margaret did not sleep, could not afford to. She sat in the dark cabin listening to the sounds of the desert night. Coyotes calling to each other in the distance. The wind brushing against the walls. the settling creaks of wood cooling after the day's heat. Around midnight, she allowed herself to remember the rest of that day at Shiloh. After she had bandaged the Confederate boy and left him in the mud, she had fought for 6 more hours, had killed 11 more men, had watched her best friend, Captain John Morgan, take a bullet meant for her and die in her arms, blood frothing on his lips as he tried to tell her something she could not hear over the roar of cannon fire. She had held him as he died, had promised him she would survive, would make his death mean something. But John had left behind a wife and a son, a baby boy named Daniel who would grow up never knowing his father, never knowing that his father's last act had been to save a woman who killed for a living. Margaret had carried that guilt for 20 years, carried it west trying to outrun it, thought she had succeeded. Now sitting in the dark with a rifle across her knees, she wondered if perhaps this was the bill finally coming due. If James Thornton represented not just her past but all the debts she owed to all the people she had failed to save. She wondered if she would survive paying it. 2 miles from Margaret's cabin, the 6 riders made camp in a dry wash that offered cover from the wind and concealment from any passing eyes. They built no fire. Frank sat propped against a boulder, his broken wrist splinted with sticks and cloth torn from his shirt. Even in the moonlight, his face looked waxy with pain. Billy paced nervous energy, finding no outlet. The 2 brothers, Nathan and Samuel Cole, sat side by side, speaking in low tones. The youngest, Danny Morgan, tended the horses, his movements automatic, his mind clearly elsewhere. Thornton stood apart, staring back toward where Margaret's cabin sat invisible in the darkness. His hand kept returning to the scar on his forearm, tracing it. The night breeze carried the smell of dust and creosote. Somewhere a night bird called lonely and distant. "We should leave," Billy said for the 3rd time. "Did you see what she did to Frank? That wasn't normal. That woman's not right." "Shut up, Billy," Nathan Cole said without heat. "I'm serious. She moved like a soldier," Thornton finished. He turned to face his men. "She moved like someone with training. Real training. The kind you don't forget." Samuel Cole leaned forward. "So what? Lots of people got trained in the war. Doesn't make her special." "It does if she's who I think she is." Silence fell. Danny stopped fussing with the horses and moved closer. Even Frank, lost in his own pain, seemed to focus. "You think it's her," Billy whispered. "Ghost hand." "I think," Thornton said carefully, "that we just met a woman living alone in the middle of nowhere who doesn't want company, who moves like a trained killer, and who's the right age." He paused. "And I think that woman broke Frank's wrist like it was nothing and disarmed you so fast you never saw it coming." "Could be coincidence," Nathan said, but his voice carried doubt. "Could be." Thornton sat down his back against a rock. "Or could be that after 21 years of searching, I finally found her." Danny cleared his throat. Young, uncertain, but the question had to be asked. "And if it is her, what do we do?" Thornton was quiet for a long time. The moon climbed higher, turning the desert silver. Finally, he spoke, his voice carrying a weight that had not been there before. "Let me tell you about Shiloh. April 6th, 1862. I was 19 years old. Thought I was fighting for something that mattered. Got a Union bayonet through my arm for my trouble." He held up his right arm, showing the long scar. "Went clear through, hit an artery. I was bleeding out in the mud, calling for my mama like the scared kid I was. Thought I was going to die there alone in a peach orchard 1,000 miles from home." The men listened. They had heard pieces of this story before, but never the whole thing. Never with this much emotion. "Then someone found me, a Union scout. Young woman, maybe 20. Should have shot me. Should have walked on by. Enemy soldier, that's what I was. But she didn't." Thornton's voice dropped lower. "She tore cloth from her own shirt and bandaged my arm. Tight, professional, like she'd done it 100 times before. Gave me water. Told me to stay down, stay quiet, that stretcher bearers would find me. I asked her why. Why save an enemy? She didn't answer at first, just kept working on the bandage. But when I grabbed her wrist, desperate to know, she looked at me." He paused. Her eyes were the coldest thing I ever seen. Not cruel, just empty. Like she'd seen so much death it didn't touch her anymore. And she said, "Because you're just a boy. Go home if you can." I asked her name. She hesitated, then said, "They call me Ghost Hand." And she was gone. Just like that. Into the smoke. Billy whistled low. She saved your life. She did, and I spent the next 21 years trying to figure out why, trying to understand what it meant that an enemy showed me more mercy than anyone on my own side ever did. So this ain't about robbery, Nathan said. This is about finding her. This is about knowing, Thornton corrected, about understanding why she did it. What it was about me or her or that moment that made her choose life when everything around us was death. Danny spoke up, his voice young but earnest. Maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe she just didn't want you to die. Maybe, Thornton agreed, but I need to hear it from her. Need to look her in the eye and know. Frank groaned. So what? We just gonna ask her politely after she broke my damn wrist? No. Thornton's voice went hard. We're going back tomorrow night, and we're not giving her a choice this time. The men exchanged glances. This had escalated beyond a simple robbery, beyond even their usual violence. This was personal now. Personal and dangerous. What if she kills us? Billy asked. She could, she's fast enough. Then I'd die knowing, Thornton said. Better than spending another 20 years wondering. Margaret dozed in the chair, Winchester across her lap, trusting her instincts to wake her if danger approached. Near dawn, she startled awake, hand automatically going to the rifle, but the cabin remained quiet. No sounds of approach, no threat. She stood, joints protesting after hours in the chair, and moved to the window. The pre-dawn light painted the desert in shades of gray. Empty, peaceful, lying. She made coffee strong and black and drank it standing at the window. As the sun rose, bringing hard light and heat, she made her decision. They would come back. Tonight, tomorrow, soon. And when they did, she needed to be ready. Not just with weapons, with traps, with strategy, with every skill she had spent 20 years trying to forget. Ghost Hand would have to wake up, just for a little while, just long enough to survive. She went to the barn and gathered materials, wire, nails, boards that looked solid but would crack under weight. She spent the morning setting traps around the property. A wire stretched across the path from the road, hidden in the scrub. A loose board propped over a shallow pit. The old bear trap she had found when they first claimed this land, cleaned, oiled, and hidden near the corral. Military preparations for a military threat. Each trap carefully placed where an attacker would naturally move, where darkness would hide the danger until too late. She worked with calm efficiency, muscle memory, taking over, and tried not to think about how easily it all came back. By afternoon, the work was done. The property looked unchanged, but now it was a killing field. Anyone approaching without knowing the layout would trigger at least one trap, maybe more. Margaret stood on the porch and surveyed her work, felt the old familiar readiness settling into her bones. This was what she had been, what she had tried so hard to stop being. A weapon, aimed and fired by whoever paid the price. Except this time, no one was paying. This time, she fought for herself, for Sarah, for the life Thomas had given her. That made it different. It had to. As the sun dropped toward evening again, Margaret made one final preparation. She went to the cedar chest and lifted out the coat, held it up. The blue wool smelled of mothballs and memory. Her hands shook as she put it on. It still fit, as if no time had passed, as if 20 years of peace had been nothing but a dream, and Ghost Hand had never really left at all. She stood in front of the cracked mirror in the bedroom and looked at herself. 41 years old. Gray streaking her dark hair, lines around her eyes and mouth from sun and laughter and grief. But in the coat with the weight of it on her shoulders, she looked different. Harder, colder, like the woman she had been at Shiloh, at Antietam, at all the other battlefields where she had turned men into corpses with methodical precision. I'm sorry, Thomas, she whispered to the empty room. I tried. Outside, the desert waited, and somewhere in that vast emptiness, 6 men prepared to ride, to come back, to force answers from the woman who had broken one man's wrist as easy as snapping kindling. They would get their answers. Margaret would make sure of that. But whether those answers satisfied them, whether they walked away afterward or died trying to take what was not theirs to take, that remained to be seen. She checked the Winchester one more time. 21 rounds, more than she should need, more than she wanted to need. She positioned herself by the window where she could see the road and settled in to wait. The sun set, darkness came, and with it the sound she had been expecting. The soft thunder of hooves, multiple riders, coming fast now. No more pretense of courtesy. Margaret's pulse stayed steady. Her hands did not shake. She was ghost hand again, and ghost hand did not miss. The battle when it came would be brief, brutal, final, and in the silence afterwards she would have to live with what she had become. Again. The night erupted in chaos. Margaret heard them coming when they were still half a mile out, the thunder of hooves on hard-packed earth, carrying clear in the desert silence. 6 riders moving fast, no longer pretending this was about water or hospitality. This was an attack. She stood behind the window shutter, watching their approach through the narrow gap. They had split into pairs flanking wide to come at the cabin from 3 directions. Smart. Military tactics. Thornton had training too then. That made this more dangerous. The moon hung full and bright, turning the desert silver. Good for seeing, bad for hiding. Margaret tracked each rider's position, calculating distances, angles of approach. The big one, Frank, came from the west, despite his broken wrist, riding one-handed but determined. The nervous one, Billy, approached from the north. The 2 brothers split east and west. Thornton held back, watching, commanding. And the young one, Danny, came straight up the center path. Margaret's first trap caught Nathan Cole. The wire she had strung across the eastern approach, hidden low in the scrub grass, caught his horse at the ankles. The animal screamed and went down hard, throwing Nathan clear. He hit the ground with a heavy thud that Margaret heard even through the cabin walls. The horse thrashed, trying to rise, leg tangled in wire. Nathan's curses split the night. Loud, panicked, amateur. Billy Reed, approaching from the north, carried a lantern to light his way. Fool mistake. Margaret sighted carefully through the crack in the shutter, led the target by a fraction, and squeezed. The Winchester kicked against her shoulder, familiar as breathing. The lantern exploded in a shower of glass and flame. Billy screamed and dropped it, stumbling backward into darkness. The flames died in the dust. She's shooting. Billy's voice climbed high. Jim, she's shooting at us. I can hear that, Thornton called back, his voice hard. Circle around. Stay in cover. But there was precious little cover on this flat land. Margaret had chosen the location for exactly that reason. Anyone approaching had to cross open ground. 50 yards of it on every side. Kill zone, military terminology. Death trap in plain English. Frank Wade came on from the west, teeth gritted against the pain in his wrist, rage overriding sense. He had a revolver in his good hand, but held it awkwardly, aim-wandering. Margaret could have dropped him easy, could have put a bullet through his chest from this distance with her eyes closed. Instead, she waited, watched him ride closer. Closer, into range of her second line of defense. The loose board she had positioned over the shallow pit gave way under his horse's weight. Not deep enough to break a leg, but enough to throw the animal off balance. The horse reared. Frank, one-handed, could not hold on. He pitched backward out of the saddle and landed hard on his broken wrist. His scream was inhuman, pure agony. It echoed across the empty land, a sound that made even hardened men flinch. Samuel Cole, coming from the opposite side, froze at the sound. Margaret saw his shape silhouetted against the moonlit horizon, saw him wrestling with the decision. Help his brother or keep pushing forward. In that moment of hesitation, Margaret fired again, not at Samuel. At the ground, 2 feet in front of his horse, dust geysered up. The horse spooked, wheeling, nearly throwing him. Fall back! Thornton's voice cut through the chaos. Everyone pull back. But Danny Morgan, the youngest, had already committed. He rode straight up the main path, the one that looked clear and safe. The one where Margaret had placed her oldest, deadliest trap. The bear trap's jaws closed with a sound like thunder. They caught Danny's horse just above the right front hoof. The animal's scream was worse than Frank's, had been a sound of pure terror and pain. It went down, thrashing Danny, barely managing to kick free of the stirrups before 1,000 pounds of panicked horse crushed him. He hit the ground and the horse rolled over him. Once, twice, then lay still, breath coming in wheezing gasps. Dying. Danny did not move. Margaret lowered the rifle. The night fell quiet except for Frank's sobbing and the dying horse's labored breathing. 5 shapes retreated into the darkness beyond her fence line. Not running. Pulling back to regroup. To count their losses. She had hurt them. Broken them. But not beaten them. Not yet. The question was what happened next. Margaret waited. 1 minute. 2. 5. No further movement. They had pulled back far enough that even her sharp eyes could not track them in the darkness. But they were out there, watching, planning. She could not stay locked in the cabin forever. Eventually she would run out of water, of food, of ammunition. And Sarah waited at Mrs. Patterson's, trusting her mother to return. That trust had an expiration date. So Margaret did something that Ghost Hand would have called tactical, that a normal person would call insane. She opened the door and walked out. No rifle, no pistol, just Margaret in Thomas's old coat standing on her porch in the moonlight, making herself a target, inviting the shot. It did not come. "I know you're watching, Thornton," she called out. Her voice carried clear in the still air. "I know what you want. You want answers about Shiloh, about why I saved you." Silence answered, but she could feel eyes on her, multiple sets, fingers on triggers. "I'm going to tell you," she continued, "but not while your boy is dying out there. Not while Frank's wrist is broken and Nathan might have a busted leg." More silence. Then from the darkness, Thornton's voice. Careful. Suspicious. "What are you offering?" "A truce for tonight. Let me tend your wounded, then we talk. Like human beings instead of animals." "Why would you do that?" "Because," Margaret said, and found she meant it, "I'm tired of making widows. I'm tired of sending boys home in boxes or not at all. I've killed 87 men in my life, Thornton. I don't want to add 6 more unless you make me." The admission hung in the air, 87. The number she had carried for 20 years carved into her soul like a brand. "How do we know you won't shoot us the second we show ourselves?" "You don't," Margaret said honestly, "but your boy Danny is dying, and you know it. So you've got a choice. Trust me for the next hour or bury him come morning." The silence stretched so long Margaret thought they would refuse. Then Thornton rode out of the darkness. Alone. Hands raised showing empty palms. He stopped at the fence line. "If this is a trick," he said quietly, "if you harm any of my men, I will burn this place to the ground with you in it." "If this was a trick," Margaret replied, "you'd already be dead. Now help me get that boy inside before he bleeds out." Danny Morgan had not been crushed by the horse, luck pure and simple, but his right leg had caught in the bear trap when he fell, and the steel teeth had gone deep. Margaret could see white bone through the torn flesh when Thornton helped her cut away his trouser leg. The boy was unconscious shock, taking him under, which was a mercy. The pain when he woke would be considerable. They carried him into the cabin and laid him on Margaret's bed. She lit all the lamps, needing light for what came next. Thornton stood by, watching her work with an intensity that made her skin prickle, studying her hands as they moved with practiced efficiency, studying the scars, the way she did not hesitate, did not flinch from the blood. "You've done this before," he said. "Not a question. Field surgery, more times than I can count." Margaret poured whiskey over the wound. Danny jerked and moaned but did not wake. "Hold him down. This next part's going to hurt." "He's already unconscious." "Not for long." She was right. The moment she began cleaning the wound, probing for debris, checking that the bone was not shattered, Danny's eyes snapped open and he screamed. Thornton held his shoulders. Margaret worked fast, ruthlessly efficient. Clean, bandage, splint. Stop the bleeding or nothing else mattered. When she finished, Danny had passed out again. Margaret washed her hands in the basin, blood swirling pink in the water. She dried them on a towel and turned to face Thornton. "He'll live, might have a limp, but he'll walk." "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. The night's not over." Thornton studied her. "Why did you do this?" "Really?" Margaret sat down heavily in the chair by the bed. Exhaustion crashed over her like a wave. She had not slept in 2 days, had been running on pure adrenaline and old training. Now with the immediate crisis handled, her body demanded rest she could not afford. "You want to know about Shiloh," she said. "Fine, I'll tell you. But first you need to understand something about that war, about what it did to people." She stared at her hands, scarred, stained with more blood than this. So much blood. "I was 20 years old when I enlisted," she began. "Lied about being a boy, at first cut my hair, bound my chest. Lasted 3 months before they figured it out. Should have been discharged. But I could shoot, better than anyone in the company. So they made me a scout instead. You killed from distance, kept your hands clean." "No," Margaret's voice went hard. "Nothing about it was clean. I killed 87 men before the war ended, 87 sons and fathers and brothers. I know because I counted, because every single one of them deserved to be remembered, even if I was the only one who would do it. Thornton said nothing, waited. At Shiloh, I killed 16 men in one day. April 6th, the peach orchard. I was in a tree and they were below, and I just kept firing until they stopped moving. Kept my unit alive by stacking corpses. Then why save me? Margaret looked up at him. Because after 16, I climbed down from that tree and I walked through what I'd done. And they weren't soldiers anymore. They were just priests. Younger than me, most of them, lying in the mud with their faces gone or their guts spilling out. And I realized I'd stopped seeing them as human. She swallowed hard. When I found you bleeding and crying for your mama, something broke in me. Or maybe fixed. I don't know, but I looked at you and I saw a person. Not a target, not a uniform. Just a scared boy who wanted to live. So you saved me. So I saved you. And then I went right back to killing. Another 11 men that day. By sunset, I'd added your side to my count. 27 dead because of me in one battle. The cabin fell quiet. Outside, dawn was beginning to gray the eastern sky. In the distance, Margaret could hear Frank's whimpering. Could hear the low voices of the other men arguing about something she could not make out. I spent 21 years searching for you, Thornton said finally. 21 years wondering why, trying to understand what it meant, and now you're telling me it was just a moment, just a random impulse? No. Margaret shook her head. It meant something. It meant that even in the middle of hell, we get to choose. We get to decide if we're going to be monsters or if we're going to hold on to whatever humanity we have left. And which did you choose? I don't know. I saved you. Then I went back to killing. What does that make me? Thornton had no answer. He looked down at Danny, unconscious and pale on the bed. This boy, he's 23 years old. His father died at Antietam. Never knew him. Grew up angry, looking for somewhere to put that anger. I took him in, taught him to rob, to hurt people, to be just like me. You can unteach him. Can any of us undo what we've become? Margaret thought of Thomas, of the 7 years of peace he had given her, of Sarah, bright and trusting and whole in a way Margaret had never been, of the garden growing despite the desert, of the cabin standing solid against the wind. Yes, she said, if we're willing to pay the price. And what's the price? Everything. Admitting what we are, accepting what we've done, and then choosing every single day to be better than we were. Thornton walked to the window. The sun was rising now, painting the desert in shades of gold and red. Beautiful, indifferent to the violence men did in its presence. I don't know if I can do that, he said quietly. Neither did I, but Thomas showed me it was possible, gave me a reason to try. Thomas, my husband, died 3 years ago. Margaret's voice softened. He knew what I was, what I'd done, and he loved me anyway. Told me the past was just that, past. That every day was a chance to choose different. Sounds like a good man, the best I ever knew. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun climb. Then Thornton turned back to her. I need to get my men. Frank needs his wrist set properly. Nathan might be hurt worse than we thought. Bring them in. I'll do what I can. Why we came here to hurt you, to take what we wanted. Margaret met his eyes. Because that boy lying there is someone's son. Because Frank and Billy and the others are human beings who made bad choices but don't deserve to die for them. Because you came looking for Ghost Hand and found her. And Ghost Hand has killed enough. Thornton studied her face, looking for deception, for the trap. But Margaret was too tired to lie, too tired to be anything except exactly what she was, a woman who had killed too many times and was trying desperately to stop. I'll bring them in, Thornton said. But Margaret, one day you're going to have to tell me why you really stayed. Why you didn't run when you knew we were coming. I stayed because this is my home, because I have a daughter who needs me, because running never solved anything except to delay the inevitable. She paused, and because maybe deep down I wanted you to find me, wanted someone to know, to bear witness to what Ghost Hand was and is and might still be. That's a heavy burden. It's mine to carry. Thornton left to gather his men. Margaret stood at the window and watched him go. The sun was fully up now, harsh and bright. Another day in the desert. Another day of heat and dust and the slow grinding away of anything soft. She thought about Sarah safe at Mrs. Patterson's, about the promise she had made to come back, about whether she could keep that promise or if the past had finally caught up too completely to escape. Behind her, Danny moaned in his sleep. Margaret turned and checked his bandages, still holding. No fresh blood. He would make it. Whether he would thank her for that remained to be seen. The men came slowly helping each other. Frank's face was gray with pain and blood loss. Nathan limped badly, one leg swollen to twice its normal size. Billy looked haunted, jumping at shadows. Samuel supported his brother, and Thornton brought up the rear, watching Margaret for any sign of betrayal. They filed into the cabin like defeated soldiers, which Margaret supposed they were. She had beaten them without killing them, had shown them mercy when they expected violence. That was its own kind of defeat. Frank first, she said. That wrist needs to be set or he'll never use it again. It took 3 men to hold Frank down while Margaret manipulated the broken bones back into alignment. His screams rattled the windows. But when it was done, when the splint was in place and the swelling beginning to subside, he looked at her with something approaching respect. You could have killed me out there, he said, voice rough. I could have killed all of you. Margaret moved to Nathan, began examining his leg. Bruised, not broken, though he would not be riding for a few days. I chose not to. That doesn't make us friends, Frank. It makes you alive. Don't confuse the two. She worked through them all. Bandaging, splinting, administering whiskey for the pain and water for the dehydration. Basic field medicine. The kind she had performed 100 times in muddy camps and blood-soaked hospital tents. The kind she had hoped never to need again. When everyone was tended, she stepped back and surveyed her work. 6 men in various states of injury sprawled around her cabin like battle casualties, which they were. Now what? Billy asked. He looked young, suddenly stripped of bravado by pain and fear. Do we just leave pretend this didn't happen? That depends on Thornton, Margaret said. He's the one who came looking for answers. Did he get them? All eyes turned to their leader. Thornton sat in Thomas's old chair, the one by the fireplace. He looked tired, old, a man carrying too much weight for too long. I got answers, he said slowly, just not the ones I expected. He looked at Margaret. You saved me because in that moment you remembered what it meant to be human, to see another person instead of an enemy. Yes. And then you went right back to being a killer. Yes. So what does that make you? What does that make any of us? Margaret sat down on the floor, too tired to stand anymore. I've been asking myself that question for 20 years. Best answer I've got is this. We're both. We're capable of terrible things and beautiful things, sometimes in the same breath. The question isn't what we are, it's what we choose to do with what we are. I've killed men for money, Thornton said, robbed families, hurt people who never did me wrong, because I was angry, because I survived when better men died, because I couldn't figure out what I was supposed to do with the life you gave me. That's on you, not me. I gave you a second chance. What you did with it was your choice. Was it? Thornton's voice cracked. Or did you doom me? Maybe I should have died in that mud. Maybe everything I've done since is on you. Margaret felt the words like a knife because she had thought the same thing about John Morgan, who died saving her, about all the men she had let live who went on to kill others, about whether mercy was always right or if sometimes the kinder thing was to end it quick and clean. I don't have an answer to that, she admitted. All I know is I made the choice I could live with. You have to make yours. The cabin fell silent. Outside, the day grew hot. Inside, men grappled with questions that had no easy answers, with the weight of choices made and consequences lived. Danny stirred on the bed. His eyes fluttered open, confused, in pain. He looked around until he found Margaret. You, he whispered. You saved me. Don't make a habit of needing it. Why bowing? Same question everyone asked. Why show mercy to someone who came to hurt you? Margaret moved to the bedside, looked down at this young man, barely more than a boy, who rode with outlaws and probably thought himself tough, who had no idea what real violence looked like, what it could. What's your father's name? She asked. What? Your father, you said he died at Antietam. What was his name? John Morgan. captain in the 23rd Indiana. Why waham? The world stopped just for a moment, just long enough for Margaret to feel every year of those 20 years crash down on her at once. John Morgan, she repeated, numb, disbelieving. Did you know him? He died saving my life. The words came out flat, dead. Took a bullet meant for me. Bled out in my arms while I tried to stop it. His last words were to tell his wife he loved her. And his son, his baby son Daniel. Danny Daniel stared at her. You're lying. I'm not. He had brown hair and green eyes and a scar on his chin from falling off a horse when he was 12. He could sing every drinking song ever written, and he made the best coffee I ever tasted. He was my best friend, and he died because of me. Tears ran down Danny's face. He was a hero, my father. The best man I ever knew. Better than me by a mile. Margaret's own eyes stung, but she blinked the tears back. And I've carried the guilt of his death for 20 years. Wondered what kind of man his son would grow up to be. If he'd know his father was brave and kind and good. She looked at Danny, at this outlaw who rode with men who hurt people for money, and felt her heart break all over again. Now I know, and John would be ashamed. The words hit like a slap. Danny flinched, but Margaret pressed on, ruthless in her honesty. Your father died so I could live, so I could use my skills to save others, to make his sacrifice mean something. And what did I do? I killed 27 more men that day. I kept killing for 2 more years. I turned his gift into more death. That's not, and you, Margaret cut him off. You took the life he gave you and you threw it away. Became exactly the kind of man he spent his whole life fighting against. You think he'd be proud? You think he died so his son could rob and hurt and terrorize innocent people? Danny sobbed, raw, broken. I didn't know. I never knew him. Then know him now, and Margaret's voice softened. Be the man he was, the man he wanted you to be. Make his death mean something, instead of just another casualty in a war that never really ended. She stood and walked away before her own tears could fall. Went to the window and stared out at the desert, at the blood-stained dirt, at the evidence of the violence that had visited her home again, despite all her efforts to leave it behind. Behind her, the cabin was silent. Then Danny's voice, small and shattered. I'm sorry, God, I'm so sorry. Margaret did not turn around, could not bear to see his face and know that John's son had needed her to shame him into decency, that the sacrifice of a good man had produced this. But Thornton spoke, his voice rough with emotion Margaret had not heard before. So am I, boy, so am I. The day stretched long and uncomfortable. The wounded rested. Margaret moved among them, checking bandages, dispensing water. She found herself moving on autopilot, her mind far away, trapped in a Maryland cornfield where John Morgan had pushed her aside and taken the bullet that should have ended Ghost Hand forever. She remembered his weight in her arms, the way his blood had soaked through her uniform, warm and sticky, the way he had tried to smile to make it easier for her somehow, even as he drowned on his own blood. Tell Mary, he had gasped. Tell her I loved her. And Daniel. Tell my boy his father loved him. You'll tell him yourself, Margaret had said, pressing on the wound, even though she knew it was useless. The bullet had gone through his lung. He was drowning from the inside. No, but you will. Promise me, Maggie. Promise you'll find them. Tell them. I promise, but she had not kept that promise, had not even tried. Because finding them would mean explaining how their husband and father died. Would mean looking into their eyes and seeing the accusation there. You lived and he died. Why you, why not him? So she had run, west, as far as she could go, had buried Ghost Hand and Margaret both, and tried to become someone new. Except the past did not stay buried. It came riding out of the desert with 6 men and a name she had thought forgotten. Margaret, she turned. Thornton stood behind her, hat in his hands. Respectful, almost gentle. I'm taking my men and leaving. We'll ride south, out of the territory. You won't see us again. Just like that. Just like that, he studied her face. I came here looking for Ghost Hand, for the woman who saved me. But that woman doesn't exist anymore. Maybe she never did. Maybe she was just a moment of humanity in the middle of hell, and I've spent 20 years chasing a ghost. Maybe we all are. Margaret said. Ghosts haunting ourselves. Maybe. Thornton put his hat back on, looked toward the bed where Danny lay. The boy wants to stay, says he won't ride with us anymore, says he wants to make amends. Margaret's heart clenched. I can't take him in. I have Sarah to think of. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking if you'll point him towards something better. Give him a chance to be the man his father was. That's a tall order. So was saving an enemy in the middle of a battle. You managed that. Margaret thought about it. Thought about Sarah, who needed to see that people could change, who needed to learn that mercy was not weakness. Thought about John, who would want his son safe, want him whole. He can stay, she said finally, work off his debt, help rebuild what you all damaged. But he steps out of line once he's gone. And if he ever threatens Sarah, I'll put a bullet through him myself. Fair enough. Thornton extended his hand. Margaret looked at it for a long moment, then took it. His grip was firm, honest. I'm sorry, he said quietly, for coming here, for putting you through this, for making you become Ghost Hand again. I'm not sorry. The words surprised her as much as they surprised him. I needed to face this, needed to know I could protect what matters without losing myself completely. Needed to know the past doesn't own me unless I let it. Does it own you? Margaret smiled, sad, knowing. A little, but less than it did yesterday. They loaded the wounded onto horses, Frank gray-faced but steady, Nathan legs splinted and strapped to keep the weight off, Billy jumpy but alive, Samuel supporting his brother, and Thornton carrying the weight of command and conscience, both. One more thing, Margaret said as they prepared to ride. What you said earlier, about me dooming you by saving you. That was fear talking, not truth. How do you know? Because I've lived with that same fear for 20 years. And I've finally figured out that we're not responsible for what other people do with the chances we give them. We're only responsible for giving the chance in the first place. The rest is on them. Thornton considered this, then nodded. I hope you're right. Me too. They rode out slowly wounded men on tired horses heading south toward whatever came next. Margaret watched until they disappeared, then turned to find Danny standing behind her, leaning heavily on a crutch she had fashioned from a broken shovel handle. You should be in bed, she said. Couldn't let them leave without saying goodbye. He watched the dust settle. They're all I had, for 3 years. They're outlaws and thieves, I know, but they were my family, or what passed for one. He looked at her. What do I do now? Now you rest, heal, and then you work. I've got a fence that needs mending, a garden that needs tending, and about 100 other things that need doing. And after that, you figure out who you want to be, not who your father was, not who Thornton wanted you to be, who Daniel Morgan chooses to become. The name settled on him like an ill-fitting coat. He grimaced. I haven't been Daniel in a long time. Been Danny, outlaw, thief. Then it's time to remember. Your father was Daniel, brave and true. Maybe you can be too. He said nothing for a long time. Then quietly, I'll try. That's all anyone can do. The next morning, Margaret rode to Mrs. Patterson's to collect Sarah. The girl ran to her before she even dismounted, arms wrapping tight around her waist. You came back. You promised and you came back. I always will, honey, always. Margaret held her close, breathing in the smell of her hair. Safe, whole hers. Mrs. Patterson stood on the porch, arms crossed. There was shooting. We heard it even from here. It's handled. Margaret, I've known you 5 years, never asked about your past. But those men who came here, they were dangerous, and you handled them like you've done it before. Margaret met the older woman's eyes, steady, not apologizing. I have. Done it before. Thought so. Mrs. Patterson nodded. Well, whatever you were, you're a good mother now. That girl adores you. That's what matters. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just keep her safe. Keep yourself safe. This territory is getting more dangerous every year. Women like us, we have to watch each other's backs. Margaret thought about that as she rode home with Sarah chattering beside her about the kittens and Mrs. Patterson's awful cooking and how glad she was to be going home. Women like us. Women who survived, who protected what mattered, who did what needed doing without waiting for someone else to do it. Maybe that was its own kind of strength. Not the strength to kill, the strength to keep living, to keep choosing, to keep trying even when the past came calling with 6 men and 21 years of questions. At the cabin, Sarah pulled up short when she saw Danny on the porch. "Who's that?" "That's Danny. He's going to be staying with us for a while, helping out." "Why?" Margaret swung down from the saddle. "Because everyone deserves a second chance, even people who make bad choices." Sarah studied the young man. "Did he make bad choices?" "Yes." "Are you going to teach him to make better ones?" "I'm going to try." Sarah seemed to accept this. She marched up to Danny and stuck out her hand. "I'm Sarah. I live here. I can shoot and ride, and I'm learning to read. What can you do?" Danny nonplussed shook her hand. "I can steal and lie and hurt people. Those aren't very useful skills." "No," Danny agreed. "They're not." "Then I guess Margaret will have to teach you better ones. She's good at teaching." Sarah turned to her mother. "Can I show him the garden? He needs to know what to water." "Yes, but don't tire him out. He's still healing." Sarah took Danny's free hand, the one not holding the crutch, and pulled him gently toward the garden. Margaret watched them go, the outlaw and the child, the man who needed redemption, and the girl who did not know enough to withhold it. Maybe that was how it worked. Maybe you did not heal the past by burying it. You healed it by moving forward, by choosing every day to be better than you were, by accepting second chances and offering them to others, by being human even when it hurt. That night, after Sarah was asleep and Danny was settled in the small room off the kitchen that had been meant for storage, Margaret sat on the porch in Thomas's rocking chair. The desert spread before her, vast and dark and full of hidden things. Somewhere out there, Thornton and his men rode toward whatever future they would choose. Somewhere out there, the past waited patient and inevitable. But here in this moment, Margaret had what mattered. A daughter safe in her bed. A man trying to be better than he was. A home that had withstood assault and stood firm. A choice made daily to protect instead of destroy. Ghost Hand was not dead, would never be fully dead. She lived in the scars on Margaret's hands, in the muscle memory of a rifle against her shoulder, and in the count of 87 that would never change. But Ghost Hand did not have to be in control. Margaret Carson could be stronger, could choose mercy over violence, could show a fatherless boy how to honor the man he never knew by becoming someone worthy of that legacy. The stars wheeled overhead, the desert breathed, and Margaret rocked slowly, Thomas's chair creaking beneath her, alive and whole, and determined to stay that way. The past had come calling. She had faced it, and she had won. Not by killing, by choosing not to. That was a victory worth having. 3 weeks passed in a rhythm that almost felt like peace. Danny healed slowly, the wound in his leg closing clean despite the depth of it. Margaret changed his bandages daily, watching for infection that never came. The boy was young, strong. His body remembered how to mend itself. Sarah took to Danny like a curious cat investigating something new. She pestered him with questions about his life, his travels, the places he had seen. Danny answered carefully, editing out the violence, the theft, the parts of his story that would give a 12-year-old nightmares. But Margaret heard the gaps, knew what he was not saying. In the mornings, Danny helped with what he could. One-legged, he could still feed the horses, could shell beans, could mend harness with patient fingers. Margaret taught him the small skills of homesteading, how to read the sky for rain that rarely came, how to coax vegetables from stubborn soil, how to fix what broke instead of discarding it. Sarah taught him letters. She sat beside him on the porch, primer open between them, sounding out words with exaggerated patience. Danny, who could barely read, struggled through sentences meant for children half his age. But he tried. That counted for something. At night after Sarah slept, Margaret and Danny sometimes talked. Quiet conversations in the lamplight. He asked about his father. Margaret told him what she remembered. John's laugh, his terrible singing voice, the way he could make coffee over a campfire that tasted better than anything brewed in a proper kitchen. The way he had died with a smile, trying to make it easier for the people he was leaving behind. "He sounds like a good man," Danny said one night. "The best I knew, until Thomas." "Your husband?" "Yes." "What would he think about me being here?" Margaret considered the question. Thomas, who had seen her scars and loved her anyway, who had built this cabin with his own hands and promised her a life where the past could not reach. What would he think about an outlaw sleeping in his storage room? He would think, she said slowly, that everyone deserves a chance to be better than they were, and he would tell me to make sure you earned it. I will. I swear I will. Margaret wanted to believe him, wanted to think that John's son could become John's legacy, but she had been disappointed too many times, had seen too many men promise change and deliver only more violence. So she watched and waited and kept the Winchester close. The attack came on a Tuesday, late afternoon when the heat had peaked and begun its slow retreat. Margaret was in the garden showing Sarah how to tell which tomatoes were ready for picking. Danny sat on the porch working on a shirt Margaret had given him to mend. Peaceful, ordinary, the kind of moment that made you forget the world held danger. Then the horses started screaming. Margaret's head snapped up. The sound was wrong. Not the normal complaints of animals in the heat, but genuine terror. She was moving before thought caught up, running for the cabin for the Winchester. Sarah ran behind her, eyes wide. Get inside, under the bed, don't come out. Ma, what? Now! Sarah ran. Margaret grabbed the rifle from beside the door, checked the load by instinct. 20 rounds. Enough. It had to be enough. She reached the porch as two riders came around the side of the barn. Nathan and Samuel Cole, the brothers. They had split from the group 2 days ago, unable to accept Thornton's decision to leave. Frank and Billy had stayed with Jim, but the Coles' wounded pride demanded blood. Something that had been festering for 3 weeks. You, Nathan's voice cracked like breaking glass. You broke my leg, humiliated us. He had a rifle. Samuel carried a shotgun. Both weapons pointed at the cabin, at her. Margaret raised the Winchester. Leave now, this is your only warning. We're done with warnings. Samuel's voice was cold, dead. Jim might be soft, might be willing to let you live, but we're not Jim. I didn't kill you, Margaret said. Her voice stayed level, despite the adrenaline spiking through her blood. I could have. I chose not to. Don't make me regret that choice. Too late. Nathan kicked his horse forward. You should have killed us when you had the chance. Margaret fired. The shot took Nathan's horse in the shoulder. Not a killing shot, but enough. The animal screamed and went down, throwing Nathan hard. He hit the dirt and did not move. Knocked cold or worse. Samuel fired the shotgun. Buckshot tore through the air where Margaret had been standing. But she was already moving, diving behind the water trough, coming up with the Winchester tracking. She fired again. Missed. Samuel was moving too, circling, trying to get an angle. Danny appeared in the doorway, a pistol in his hand. Thomas's old Colt, the one Margaret kept in the kitchen drawer. She had shown him where it was just in case. The one she should have searched him for, and had not because she had wanted to trust. Get back inside, she shouted. Not a chance, he fired at Samuel. The shot went wide, but it made Samuel's horse shy, spoiling his aim. Margaret used the moment. Stood, aimed, fired. The bullet took Samuel in the meat of his thigh. He screamed and nearly dropped the shotgun. His horse bolted, carrying him 20 yards before he managed to rein it in. Behind them, Nathan groaned and started to rise. Blood ran from a gash on his forehead, but he was moving, reaching for his rifle. Margaret sighted on him. Center mass, an easy shot, one she had made 1,000 times. Her finger tightened on the trigger. A new voice cut through the chaos. Stop! James Thornton rode in from the west, his horse lathered and wild-eyed. He swung down before the animal fully stopped, putting himself between Margaret and his men. Jim, get out of the way, Nathan struggled to his feet. This doesn't concern you. The hell it doesn't. Thornton's face was flushed with anger and something else, fear. I told you both. We were done. We were leaving her alone. You told us. Samuel had his leg wrapped with one hand, trying to stop the bleeding. You don't speak for us anymore. Not after she made us look like fools. She let you live. She should have killed us. At least then we'd have died with honor instead of crawling away like whipped dogs. The words hung in the desert air. Margaret kept the rifle up, covering both brothers, but her attention was split. Thornton's back was to her, exposed, vulnerable. If Nathan or Samuel fired, they would have to shoot through him. This is pride talking, Thornton said. Wounded pride, not worth dying for. That's where you're wrong. Nathan raised his rifle, not at Margaret, at Thornton. I'd rather die than live under A coward. Nathan, don't. The shot cracked, but it came from neither Nathan nor Thornton. It came from Samuel, who had brought his shotgun around. Not aimed at Thornton, aimed at Margaret. Thornton moved without thinking, threw himself sideways, tackling Margaret out of the line of fire. They went down hard, Thornton's weight driving the air from her lungs. Buckshot tore through the space where she had been standing, shredding wood and raising splinters. Then everything happened at once. Danny fired. His bullet took Samuel in the shoulder. The shotgun fell from nerveless fingers. Nathan fired. His bullet, meant for Margaret, hit the man covering her, entered Thornton's back just below the left shoulder blade, exited through his chest in a spray of red. Margaret fired from the ground. Her bullet found Nathan's center mass. He staggered backward, surprise more than pain on his face, looked down at the spreading red on his shirt, looked up at Margaret, then fell. Samuel tried to reach his shotgun. Danny fired again. This shot was not meant to wound. It took Samuel in the chest. He folded like paper and lay still. Silence crashed down. Margaret pushed out from under Thornton's weight. He rolled onto his back, hands pressed to the wound in his chest. Blood pulsed between his fingers. Too much blood. The kind that meant minutes, not hours. No, the word came out fierce, desperate. No, you don't get to die. Not like this. Funny. Thornton's voice was wet, bubbling. Spend 20 years looking for you, find you, and this is how it ends. Danny, get bandages, water. Danny hopped inside. Margaret pressed her hands over Thornton's, trying to stem the bleeding, but she could feel it. The way the blood pulsed with his heartbeat, the way his breathing rattled. This was a killing wound. She had seen enough to know. Why? She demanded. Why did you come back? Heard them talking. Each word cost him. In town, about revenge, about coming back here. Couldn't let them. He coughed. Blood flecked his lips. You gave me a second chance. Twice. Least I could do was make sure you got to keep yours. You're a fool. Yeah. He smiled, red teeth, but an honest one. Finally. Danny returned with bandages and water. Margaret worked frantically, packing the wound, trying to slow the bleeding. But it was like trying to hold back the tide. Blood everywhere, soaking through the bandages, pooling in the dirt. Thornton's hand found hers, gripped weak. Margaret, listen. Save your strength. For what we both know, I'm done. His eyes found hers, gray and clear despite the pain. Thank you, for Shiloh, for showing me that mercy was possible, even if I couldn't live up to it. You did. You just did. You saved my life. Finally did something right then. His breathing was getting shallower, faster. Tell Danny, John Morgan's boy, tell him his father would be proud of him. Not me, him. You tell him yourself, you're not dying here. But he was. They both knew it. Margaret had seen too many men die to pretend otherwise. Thornton's breathing hitched, stopped, started again weaker. One more thing, barely a whisper now. The coat, the one you wore that night, still have it. Yes. Good. Don't hide it anymore. Don't hide what you are. World needs people who'll stand, who'll protect. Be that. Be Ghost Hand, but the right way. His hand went slack in hers. His eyes stared at nothing. James Thornton, Confederate soldier, outlaw seeker of answers, was dead. Margaret sat back on her heels. Blood covered her hands. Her shirt, the ground around her. 3 bodies lay in her yard. Nathan, Samuel, Thornton, 3 more names to add to her count. 3 more ghosts, except these did not feel like the others. Nathan and Samuel had chosen this, had come looking for death and found it. That was on them. But Thornton, he had chosen to save her, had thrown away his life for hers without hesitation. That was different. That was the second chance she had given him, paid back in full. Sarah's voice, small and terrified, came from the cabin doorway. Ma, is it over? Margaret looked at her daughter, at Danny, white-faced and shaking the pistol still in his hand, at the blood and bodies and evidence of violence that had visited her home again despite all her efforts. Yes, baby, it's over. But the cleanup was just beginning. Sheriff Hayes arrived the next morning, brought by a neighbor who had heard the shooting and rode for help. He took in the scene with hard eyes. 3 bodies wrapped in canvas. Margaret, exhausted and bloodstained. Danny legs still splinted, sitting guard with a rifle. Sarah pale and quiet, clinging to her mother's side. Margaret. Hayes dismounted slowly. Tell me what happened. She told him. All of it. The first attack 3 weeks ago, Thornton's search for Ghost Hand, the uneasy truce, Nathan and Samuel's return, the final fight, Thornton's sacrifice. Hayes listened without interrupting. When she finished, he walked to the bodies, lifted the canvas covering Thornton's face, studied it for a long moment. This the man who saved you? Yes. Strange way to repay a debt, getting yourself killed. He didn't see it that way. He saw it as finally doing something right. Hayes dropped the canvas, turned to face her. You know there'll be questions. You killed 3 men. That's not nothing, even in self-defense. I know. You'll need to come to town, make a statement. There'll be an inquest. When tomorrow? Tomorrow. I'll send a wagon for the bodies. His gaze moved to Danny. And him. He fought to protect us, wounded one man who was trying to kill me. He ride with Thornton's gang. Margaret hesitated. Lying to the sheriff was a bad idea, but the truth might get Danny hanged. Danny spoke before she could answer. I did, for 3 years, rode with them, robbed with them. Then I came here and Mrs. Carson showed me a better way. He met Hayes's eyes. I'm not running. If there's charges, I'll face them. Hayes studied the young man. That's brave, or stupid. Haven't decided which. Probably both, Danny admitted. You got anyone who'll vouch for you? Anyone who can say you've changed? I will. Margaret's voice was firm. He's been here 3 weeks, worked hard, helped Sarah with her lessons, fought to protect us when those men came. He's not the same person who rode with Thornton. That'll help, but the judge might see it different. Hayes sighed. We'll sort it out. For now, bury your dead. Get cleaned up. I'll be back tomorrow with that wagon. He rode away, leaving them alone with the bodies. Margaret, Danny, and Sarah spent the afternoon digging graves. The ground was hard, unforgiving. It took hours to get the holes deep enough. They buried Nathan and Samuel together side by side like they had lived. No words spoken over them, just dirt and stones and the weight of choices made. Thornton they buried separate, on the small rise behind the cabin where the view stretched forever. Margaret stood over his grave when it was filled and tried to find words. You spent 21 years looking for answers, she said finally. I hope you found them. I hope you died knowing what your life meant. That the second chance I gave you mattered, even if it took you this long to realize it. She placed a stone on the grave, rough granite flecked with quartz that caught the light. Not a headstone, just a marker. So she would remember where he lay. Sarah slipped her hand into Margaret's. Was he a good man, Ma? He was a man who made bad choices and tried to make them right. I suppose that's the best any of us can hope for. They walked back to the cabin together. Behind them, the sun set over 3 graves in a land that had seen too much blood, but kept growing things anyway. The inquest took 3 days. Margaret sat in the courthouse and answered questions from men who had never fired a shot in anger, who could not imagine what it meant to see death coming and choose to meet it standing. She told the truth. All of it. Thornton's search, the attacks, the final confrontation. The judge, a gray-haired man named Blackwell, listened with sharp attention. When Margaret finished, he leaned back in his chair. Mrs. Carson, you admit to killing 3 men in the past month. You admit to military training, to being this ghost hand person. Why should I believe this was self-defense and not murder? Margaret met his eyes. Because I let 4 others go, Frank Wade, Billy Reed, and 2 I never learned the names of. I could have killed them all. Chose not to. If I wanted them dead, they'd be dead. That's not exactly reassuring. It's the truth. I killed Nathan and Samuel Cole because they gave me no choice. Because they came to my home with weapons and intent. Because if I hadn't, my daughter would be dead. Me too. Maybe Danny. You want to call that murder? Go ahead. But it was survival. Blackwell considered this. And James Thornton. You say he died saving you. He did. Took a bullet meant for me, died in my arms asking me to be better than I was, to use what I am to protect instead of destroy. Her voice hardened. You want to prosecute a dead man for the crime of sacrifice that's on you. The courtroom fell silent. Then Danny stood, hobbled forward on his crutch to stand beside Margaret. Your Honor, if I may, James Thornton was my friend, was like a father to me, and he was a bad man. Robber, thief, probably worse. But in the end, he chose right, chose to save instead of hurt. Mrs. Carson didn't make him do that. He chose it, and that choice cost him everything. Blackwell's gaze moved to Danny. You rode with his gang. I did. I'm not proud of it, but I'm done with that life. Mrs. Carson's given me a chance to be better, and I'm taking it. Even if it means jail time. Even then, the judge studied them both, Margaret blood-stained and exhausted but unbowed. Danny young and scared but honest. Finally, Blackwell nodded. Self-defense. All 3 deaths. You're free to go, Mrs. Carson. He paused. As for you, Mr. Morgan, given your testimony and Mrs. Carson's vouching for you, I'm inclined toward leniency. 1 year of supervised labor. You'll work for Mrs. Carson, help rebuild what your gang destroyed. You step out of line once you'll hang. Understood. Yes, Your Honor, thank you. They left the courthouse together. Outside, the town went about its business. People stared, whispered. Margaret heard the words. Ghost hand, killer, dangerous. Let them talk. She was done hiding. That night, back at the cabin, Margaret made a decision. She pulled the cedar chest from under the floor, opened it, took out the coat. Ma, Sarah watched from the doorway. What are you doing? Something I should have done a long time ago. Margaret put the coat on. It settled over her shoulders like an old promise. I've been hiding what I am, ashamed of it. But hiding doesn't change anything. I am Ghost Hand. I always will be. The question is what I do with it. What are you going to do? Margaret looked at her daughter, at Danny standing behind her, at the cabin and the land and the life she had built from nothing, at the graves on the hill and the blood that had soaked this ground. I'm going to teach, she said, teach people to protect themselves, to survive, to stand when standing is all that's left. Teach how? I don't know yet, but I'll figure it out. It took 6 months to build, a simple structure on the far side of the property, big enough for 20 people, benches for sitting, a cleared area for practice, target posts at various distances, storage for weapons and supplies. Margaret called it the Frontier Skills School, but everyone else called it the Ghost Hand School. And they came. Women mostly at first, widows, single mothers, women who lived alone and understood that the frontier did not care about fair, only about strong. Margaret taught them to shoot, to track, to read the land and the sky, to set traps and tend wounds and survive when survival seemed impossible. But more than that, she taught them something else. Strength without mercy is just violence, she told her first class. Mercy without strength is weakness. You need both. The strength to protect what matters and the mercy to know when fighting isn't the answer. Danny helped once his leg healed enough. He taught tracking, taught the hard lessons about what happened to people who chose the outlaw life, showed the scars physical and otherwise that came from living outside the law. Sarah, now 14, became Margaret's assistant. She worked with the younger students, teaching them letters and numbers alongside shooting and survival, building a generation that could read and fight and think for themselves. The school grew. Men came too, eventually. Crippled veterans who needed purpose. Young boys who wanted to learn skills their fathers had never taught. Drifters looking for something to believe in. Margaret taught them all. And in teaching, she found something she had not expected. Purpose, not the grim purpose of war where every decision meant death for someone, but a purpose built on life, on giving people the tools to survive, to protect their families, to stand against whatever came. Sheriff Hayes visited one afternoon 2 years after the school opened. He sat on a bench and watched Margaret instruct a class of 15 on proper rifle maintenance. When the lesson ended, he approached her. You've built something good here, Margaret. Trying to. Governor heard about it, wants to meet you, thinks the territory could use more places like this. The governor can visit if he wants, but I'm not changing what we do, not for politics. Hayes smiled. Figured you'd say that. But he's serious, wants to fund expansion. Set up schools like this in other towns. Make it official. Margaret considered this. Part of her wanted to refuse, to keep this small and personal and hers. But another part, the part that remembered John Morgan dying in her arms and Thornton bleeding out in the dirt, thought about legacy, about making their deaths mean something. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "Fair enough." Hayes stood to leave, then paused. "One more thing. That boy, Danny, he's done well, worked hard, stayed clean. I'm recommending his sentence be commuted. Time served. He'll appreciate that. He earned it, you both did." Hayes touched his hat brim. "You've changed, Margaret. Or maybe you just became who you were always meant to be." After he left, Margaret stood alone in the practice yard. The sun was setting, painting the desert in golds and reds. Students had gone home to families, to lives, to futures they were building one day at a time. She thought about Thornton's last words. "Don't hide what you are. Be ghost hand, but the right way." She thought she was finally beginning to understand what that meant. That evening, as the last light faded, a rider appeared on the horizon. A single man on a tired horse moving slow. Margaret watched him approach, hand resting on the rifle she always kept close. Old habits died hard. The rider stopped at the fence line. Older man, maybe 60, with the weathered look of someone who had spent his life outdoors. He dismounted carefully, favoring his left leg. "Ma'am, I'm looking for Ghost Hand." Margaret stood. "You found her." The man's eyes widened. "They said you were a woman. Didn't quite believe it." He pulled off his hat. "Name's William Price. I fought at Gettysburg, lost my leg there. Lost my farm 2 years back. Lost just about everything except my granddaughter." "What do you want from me?" "I hear you teach people to survive, to stand up, to protect what's theirs." His voice cracked. "I got nothing left to protect except that little girl. And I need to know she'll be all right when I'm gone, that she'll be strong enough to make it." Margaret saw herself in his desperation, saw Sarah, saw every person who had ever needed help and found none. How old is she? 8, smart as a whip, tough too, but she's just a child. This land eats children alive if they're not ready. Bring her tomorrow. We'll see what she's made of. Price's face crumpled with relief. "Thank you. God bless you, ma'am." After he left, Sarah emerged from the cabin. "Another one. Another one. How many is that this month?" 17. Margaret smiled. 17 people looking for hope, looking for a way to survive. I suppose that's what we give them. Is it enough just teaching them to fight? Margaret pulled her daughter close. We don't just teach them to fight, baby. We teach them to stand, to protect, to build instead of destroy, to choose mercy when they can and strength when they must. That's more than fighting, that's living. Sarah leaned against her. "Do you still miss him, Thomas?" "Every day, but I think he'd be proud of this, of what we've built." "And Thornton? Do you think he'd be proud too?" Margaret thought about the man who had spent 21 years searching for answers and found them in sacrifice. Who had died saving the woman who had once saved him? "I think," she said slowly, "that he'd say I finally figured out what that second chance was for." The stars came out. The desert breathed its cool night air. And in a cabin on the edge of nowhere, a woman who had been a killer and a survivor and a teacher sat with her daughter and planned for tomorrow. For students who would come seeking skills and leave with purpose. For a legacy built not on death, but on life. For a name, Ghost Hand, that would mean protection instead of destruction. The frontier was still hard, still unforgiving, still full of danger and loss and suffering. But now it also held this: a woman who stood, who taught others to stand, who turned weapons into tools and fear into strength. Ghost Hand lived, but she had been transformed. By Thomas, who taught her love. By Thornton, who showed her redemption. By John Morgan, whose son carried on his legacy. By Sarah, who gave her reason to wake every morning and choose to be better. The past could not be changed. 87 men would always be dead by her hand, but the future could be shaped, one student at a time, one lesson in survival that became a lesson in living. Margaret stood and looked out at the land she had claimed and defended and turned into something good. Somewhere out there, other people struggled against the same darkness she had fought, the same violence, the same despair. And tomorrow some of them would find their way here, to the cabin on the rise, to the woman in the blue coat, to Ghost Hand, and she would teach them what no one had taught her until it was almost too late. The frontier's last stand was not a battle. It was a school, a garden, a home, and Margaret Carson would defend it until her last breath, not with killing, with living, and some deserved a third. The desert wind carried voices from the past, John Morgan, Thomas, Thornton, all the men she had killed and the few she had saved, all of them watching, waiting to see what she would build from the ashes of war. She would show them, one lesson at a time, one life saved, one person taught to stand. The frontier's last stand was not a battle. It was a school, a garden, a home, and Margaret Carson, once called Ghost Hand, would defend it until her last breath, not with killing, with living.